Hello all, this is a part 2 of Chapter 2, Brain and Behavior. Today we will discuss about human nervous system, including central and peripheral nervous system, somatic and autonomic nervous system, and of course about our brains. How researchers back in the day learned about the brain when there were hardly no advanced technology, and last about left and right hemisphere of the brain. So as you can see in this figure, nervous system consists of central and peripheral nervous system. And central nervous system, which is shown on the left, is made up by our spinal cord and the brain. And the peripheral nervous system on the right is made up by our somatic and autonomic nervous system. And today we will cover all of these nervous systems. So like we discussed, central nervous system consists of our brain and the spinal cord, and more than 99% of the neurons are located in the central nervous system. And in part 1 of the video, we talked about how neurons communicate with each other. A spinal cord is a long bundle of neurons that carry messages between body and brain that is responsible for very fast reflexes. And the reason why it's responsible for fast reflexes is because it is so integrated to our human survival. So for example, if it takes very long time to send a message just to breathe air after running 10 miles, we will be dead. So it needs to be very fast and quick. So if we want to, for example, breathe or blink our eyes, our brain sends and also receives information from various parts of the body. And because CNS or central nervous system is so important to our lives, it is well protected by the bones of the skull and the spinal column, basically our backbones, which creates a hard physical barrier to injury. And peripheral nervous system is a network of nerves, which is a group of neurons, and it communicates with bodies, organs, and muscles. And so if you compare with the central nervous system, you can see that peripheral nervous system is covering most parts of our body, whereas again, central nervous system is just the brain and the spinal cord. And because peripheral nervous system is everywhere, it allows us to move our fingers to toes and even organs. And peripheral nervous system consists of somatic and autonomic nervous system. So somatic nervous system is a system that is responsible for carrying information from senses to the central nervous system and carrying information from the central nervous system to the voluntary muscles of the body. And there are two pathways that somatic nervous system uses. So there's sensory pathway and motor pathway. Sensory pathway consists of nerves coming from the sensory organs to the central nervous system. And motor pathway consists of nerves coming from the central nervous system to the voluntary muscles. So here's an example. Say that there's a fire, and accidentally an individual put the hand in the fire. Obviously, it's very hot, and the sense of temperature communicates that information to the brain using the sensory pathway. And this is how we recognize that the hand is hot. And of course, the individual probably don't want to keep the hand in the fire for a long time, so the individual tries to get off the hand from the fire using the motor pathway. Specifically, this information is passed from the central nervous system to the voluntary muscles, in this case the hand. And finally, the individual can take off the hand from the fire. Of course, this happens very quickly, but this is how somatic nervous system works. Next, if you remember peripheral nervous system, it consisted of somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. Unlike the somatic nervous system, which controls voluntary muscles, autonomic nervous system controls the involuntary muscles, organs, and glands. So what are some examples of involuntary movements in our body? Something we're not intentionally thinking about it. So some examples are like breathing, or heart rate, or digestions. Without intentionally trying to control our breathing or digestion, our body automatically does these for us. So something to be, thankful of our own body. And actually, we can further break down autonomic nervous system into two divisions or nervous system. So there is a sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. And you might have heard about these terms, for example, in a stress management class. Sympathetic nervous system is a system that is responsible for reacting to stressful events and bodily arousal. So you could kind of think about this system as a fight or flight response, where the body prepares to either stay and deal with the threats or to run away to safety by activating the sympathetic nervous system. On the other hand, parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for restoring the body to normal functioning after arousal. For example, things like meditation, deep breathing, and yoga can activate the parasympathetic nervous system, slowing our heart rate, relaxing our muscles, and facilitating our digestion. So, as we have now finished discussing the major aspect of the human nervous system, we will dive into our brain. And there are multiple ways we could split our brain, but here we will break into three and start to discuss from the hindbrain, midbrain, and last, the forebrain. So as you saw in the figure in the previous slide, hindbrain is the inner part of the brain. And as a result, it is well protected. And therefore, the parts of the hindbrain are responsible for very primitive functions that are involved in our survival. So for example, medulla is responsible for life-sustaining functions like breathing, swallowing, and heart rate. Pons are responsible for sleep and arousal. And cerebellum controls rapid fine motor movements, such as, for example, playing sports or playing a piano. And if this part is damaged, we wouldn't be able to stand up. So again, these are pretty basic primitive functions, but very critical to our survival. Next, we will discuss the midbrain, which is between the hindbrain and the forebrain. Because midbrain is a small section, there aren't many parts, and here we will discuss one, the reticular formation, which is responsible for selective attention. For example, reticular formation allows us to respond and pay attention to a sudden noise. And it's also responsible for behaviors like walking and sleeping, so basically behaviors that are characterized by frequent repetition of the same movement or gestures. And last is the forebrain. And because there are more components in the forebrain, there are more things to cover. And here we'll cover 5 of them. And a lot of the components in the forebrain is where it makes a human a human. So for example, being able to think and plan ahead. In the forebrain, there is a group of brain structures called the limbic system, which is located under the cerebral cortex and is involved in emotion, memory, and learning. And although hippocampus is oftentimes associated with memory, it appears that the memories are not stored in the hippocampus or in the limbic system, but rather it determines what parts of the information should be formed in the long-term memory, most likely in the cortex. Amygdala is responsible for fear responses and the memory of fear, which is probably why we remember traumatic events, which involves fear more than the other events. And amygdala is also known to be responsible for discriminating objects that are necessary for survivals, like selecting appropriate foods and mates. Another part of the forebrain is the thalamus, which kinds of resemble a server in a computer network, where it relays and filters information from the senses and transmit the information to the cerebral cortex. So basically telling our brains what to do. And hypothalamus is located below the thalamus. And the name are similar because hypo just means under, and the hypothalamus was named for its position, which is below the thalamus. And so the functions are quite different, where the hypothalamus is responsible for pleasurable behaviors like hunger, thirst, and sex. And the figure on the right represent what would happen when the hypothalamus is stimulated every time when the rat pushes a lever or a bar. So this is kind of similar to the continuous reinforcement, where the reinforcement, in this case a stimulation to the hypothalamus, is giving every single time the rat pushes the lever. And a result show that a rat pushes the lever more than 2,000 times per hour for 24 hours straight to just receive stimulation to the hypothalamus. So this is how much it becomes difficult to stop our pleasurable behaviors. And the last structure of the brain we will talk about is the cerebral cortex. And as you saw in the picture, cerebral cortex is the outer layer of the brain and is responsible for complex mental functions. So this is the part that makes a human, and especially our frontal lobe, which is one of the 4 lobes in our cerebral cortex, and we'll talk about it in the next several slides. And as you can see, the size of the cerebral cortex among humans is quite different compared to other animals, although other parts may not be that different. And the cerebral cortex can be divided into right and left hemispheres. But these two cerebral hemispheres are connected and allowing to communicate with each other, unless they're being cut, for example, due to medical surgery. So these two hemispheres are connected with a thick band of neurons called corpus callosum. And again, this allows the two hemispheres to communicate with each other. And as we will talk about it later, this becomes very, very important. So, cerebral cortex can be divided into 4 lobes as shown in the figure. So, occipital lobe is responsible for responding to a visual stimuli. So a person can actually have a perfect vision, but if occipital lobe is damaged, you cannot see it, because this is a place where the visual stimuli are being processed. Parietal lobe is responsible for spatial location, attention, and motor control. For example, it's used when judging how far to throw a ball or when shifting attention to one from the other. Temporal lobe is responsible for hearing, language processing, and memory. This is also connected to the limbic system. So do you remember what were included in the limbic system? So it consists of structures like hippocampus and amygdala. And as a result, when temporal lobe is damaged, we cannot file our experiences or information to the long-term memory. And last, frontal lobe is responsible for personality and intelligence. This is what makes human a human. And if the frontal lobe is damaged, a person's personality may change. So back in the day, when there were no advanced technology like CAT scans or MRIs, how did the researcher examine the function of the brain? They learn about the brain through injury. So one of the very famous examples of a case study is an accident of Phineas Gage, which occurred in 1848. And we briefly talked about it back in Chapter 1. So he was working at a railroad construction company, and as they were building railroad, they used dynamite to remove huge rocks. And when the blast occurred, a metal rod came flying at him and penetrated his skull. And before the accident, people described Gage as being quiet and mild, but after the accident, they described him as being irritable and irresponsible. They even said that he was no longer gauged. So what did we learn from this accident? We learned that the frontal lobe is probably associated with personality. Another example we learned about the brain was from the treatment for epilepsy, where an individual's corpus callosum was being cut. This surgery is still used today, especially among patients with extreme and uncontrollable forms of epilepsy, which cannot be controlled by medication. So as we talked about it earlier, corpus callosum is involved in sending messages between the two hemispheres. But if being cut, the two hemispheres are no longer able to communicate. And this will be an issue, especially with our vision. So the visual stimuli we see will both go through our left and right eyes. But the path will cross inside our brain. So what will happen is that the information from the left visual field will only go to our right hemisphere. And you can see this if you follow the green lines in the figure. And the information from the right visual field would only go to our left hemisphere. And you can see this if you follow the red lines. So in an actual example, the object we see on the left visual field, in this case a hammer, will again only be processed in our right hemisphere. And the object on the right visual field, in this case a baseball, will only be processed in our left hemisphere. And note that this will not be an issue if our two hemispheres are able to communicate with each other, but it will cause a problem if they cannot communicate. And we'll see why this is an issue if the two hemispheres cannot communicate. So looking at this table about the specialization of the two hemispheres, do you see any patterns that are responsible in the left and right hemisphere? So the left hemisphere is responsible for things like speech and grammar. And right hemisphere is responsible for like nonverbal perception, visual recognition, and also emotion. But note here that spoken language is specialized in our left hemisphere. So here I have some questions. When the two hemispheres cannot communicate, what would happen if some information came into the left hemisphere and was asked to verbally describe the object? No problem, right? An individual can describe the information without any issue because spoken language is responsible in the left hemisphere. When the two hemispheres cannot communicate, what would happen if the same information came into the right hemisphere? Could the individual verbally describe the object? The answer is no, because right hemisphere is not responsible for spoken language. So an individual may be able to recognize the object, but they will not be able to verbally describe the object. One more question. As you can see in the picture on the left, an individual is seeing a picture of a key on the left visual field and a ring on the right visual field. If the individual is asked to verbalize what she sees, what do you think she would say? And note that what the left eye sees goes to the right hemisphere, and what she sees with her right eye goes to the left hemisphere. So here she would say ring, because the visual information on the right will only be processed in the left hemisphere, which again is responsible for spoken language. And the person would not be able to verbalize the key, which is in the left visual field, because this visual information would only be processed in the right hemisphere, which again is not responsible for spoken language. And I know that this could get a little tricky, but that's all I got for today, and hopefully you have a better understanding about the human nervous system and about the brains. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks and take care.